Chapter 91. Present. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Damien, instead of answering her, raised his hand, placing his finger on his lips to say, "It's secret that's not to be spoken of." He gave her a smile before continuing to say, "Tell me, Mouse. What do you think you will receive today?" Penny wished there was an option to say nothing, but knowing Damien, that option didn't exist on anything. "How would I know, Master Damien?" "Close your eyes then," his voice demanded her to do what he wanted. Turning around and closing the trunk, "Sit here. It will be much comfortable," he said, looking at the top of the trunk. Penelope was skeptical. More than necessary. It had been not more than 12 days since he bought her from the black market, and 12 days weren't enough to get comfortable with a person. But did she have a choice? Asked Penny to herself. As she walked towards the trunk, turning around to sit on the trunk which let her feet hanging in the air, she closed her eyes. What was Damien planning? Was he going to snap her head? Or was he going to give her the supposed present he spoke of, which could either be the mark or the collar? With her sight that had turned dark, Penny heard the sound of the rustle, which was accompanied by the little metal sound which made her heart sink. It was a collar. She then felt his hand touch her hair, his fingers gently brushing her hair, which at first made her stiffen. Feeling him gather all the hair, she heard him say, "Can you hold this up for me, Penelope?" It wasn't a question but a sweet demand, as his voice caressed her without even touching her, his voice holding a sweet melody like he was coaxing a child. "Don't open your eyes." Raising her hand, she took hold of her hair, which he had bunched together for her to hold. A few pieces of strands came to fall out from her grip. She felt his hand go around this time again, but this time it wasn't to pull back her but to put the collar around her neck. Penny could already feel the heaviness that was forming in her chest and the invisible weight of the collar, which she would have to carry around her for the rest of the time she would be here to continue to be a slave. She felt something fall on her chest, where Damien said, "You can open your eyes now." Penny didn't have to be told twice, as her eyes snapped open with her hand which was holding her hair dropping down so that she could feel the leather dot-like, thick collar around her neck. But instead of a thick collar, she felt a thin chain, where she finally looked down with her hand still continuing to touch the chain to see round locket along with it. The markings. There is something which defines the Quinn family. A lot of pure-blooded families have rings, necklaces, pendants, and seals to identify the family they come from. The pendant is a little odd, but it stands out like a sign for anyone who would want to try playing with you. "It once belonged to my mother and now it is around your neck," said Damien to walk around to face her. Penny was confused. It was definitely a family heirloom, and if it was, especially something that belonged to his mother, why was he making her wear it? She looked up at Damien, who now stood in front of her, his dark red eyes looking at the chain around her neck and then up at her, to meet her eyes. "Not happy with your present?" He tilted his head in question. Damien had really given a present to her. Was he only playing with her, trying to scare her and raise her anxiety, when he had given the options of the collar and mark? "This is your mother's. Aren't you supposed to treasure it, for someone special?" Penny completed the rest of the line in her head. What was the meaning of this? Unable to resist of not asking the question, she breathed the question, "Why? Why do you think?" He questioned her question. It was one of his many habits where Damien often questioned others then answer their questions that were directed to him. "I am sure you will find out the answer if you think hard, Mouse. Unless it is going to hurt your head." What did that mean now? "We won't go down from here until you don't answer for your own question." Damien was back with his mischievous smile, his eyes sparkling as he waited for her to speak. 1 minute passed and then the second minute passed before he asked her, "Did you fall asleep again, Mouse?" She could hear the impatience in his voice. What was he getting so excited about? Before either of them could speak anything, a loud growl of thunder could be heard, resonating through the glass and the walls as if it was trying to shake the very mansion that stood on the stony hill. Soon the rain started to pour down furiously, cleaning the mansion all over again while the raindrops hit the window panes of the attic. Penny, who had been distracted by the rain, suddenly felt Damien walk towards her in just 2 steps. Leaning forward as he placed a hand of his to her side. She held her breath as he stared into her eyes. With him so close to her face, she could see the swirl of red in his eyes which were prominent. At the same time the darkness it held in a few specks, she saw herself being reflected through his eyes. The smile on his face had vanished, his eyes staring and catching every movement of hers which she was aware of making her queasy but not uncomfortably. You dumb mouse. How hard is it for you to figure out? Chapter 92. Present. Part 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Music recommendation for this chapter to listen, Amor Ex Machina and Rain Sound and Thunder. 2 hours sleep meditation sound. I have the habit of mixing up sounds to be able to imagine the scene. I hope you enjoy it together, maybe on laptop. Penelope stilled her heart, keeping it down, not wanting him to know where this conversation was going. The first few seconds of the minute that passed by she didn't understand what he was trying to achieve by giving her something that was a precious family heirloom which belonged to his mother. She would have given it some thoughts, but with the way he stood right in front of her face, staring into her eyes, Penny was finding it hard to think. It wasn't that she was scared, maybe initially she was scared of this pure-blooded vampire who had stabbed the person who was auctioning the slaves who were brought from the slave establishment. If there was something she had compared in tonight's celebration, it was the difference in which Damien treated her. He made her climb a tree, pluck weeds that were growing in the garden of the mansion when it was pouring with rain just like it was now. Was he maybe? Perhaps he like. No, that couldn't be true, she shook her head mentally. Penny tried to deduce his words with the deafening silence that held certain tranquility as the clouds continued to growl. And though it deafened everything around them, she had still managed to hear him call her as a dumb mouse. But the more time passed with him waiting as he stared at her, her heart started to beat, increasing its pace, and she hoped he wasn't able to hear it. But Damien Quinn didn't need to rely on her heartbeat. Her face was enough for him to read the emotions that were going through one by one. First came the confusion, which followed to a deep concentration as if she were in a thought, which finally came to the realization which she tried to hide but not enough from his eyes, which made him grin. Though they were inside the mansion, in the attic with the roof to protect them, Penny could feel the cold air raising goosebumps all over her skin. Her chest resonating along with the thunderous clouds. Penny felt slightly breathless, his face inching closer to only move away, and she lowered her eyes, looking away from him. Forgotten that Damien had asked her a question. He was joking with her, right? The more she thought about it, the more her head hurt. It couldn't be true. Her eyes lifted up, looking up at him. It seems you found your answer to the question. Care to share it? He asked her above the sound of the rain. She parted her lips to speak, but no voice came out from her mouth. Her eyes had turned wide, looking at Damien, who stood waiting for her. You must have your reasons, she said, trying to tiptoe from the answer he was asking. That was if what she thought was the right answer she had stumbled upon. You can get down from the trunk unless you plan to sit there the entire night. Penny scrambled down, placing her feet back on the wooden floorboards, which felt much better than the other side of the mansion, which was made of marble. If her feet healed faster, she would have been able to wear the shoes which he had bought for. Something clicked in her mind. She looked at him with a suspicious look. What is with that suspicious look on your face, Penelope? Stated Damien, and she quickly looked away to only have her eyes back at Damien, who took a step forward towards her. Penny looked at the man who stood in front of her. His handsome features only emphasized itself in the dark atmosphere of the attic. The sharp jaw and nose, his defined cheekbones that looked smooth leaning his head back, he raised his hand to ruffle over his hair, which was combed neatly in a backward direction, which now fell on his forehead recklessly. Happy with the present? She heard him ask her. Penny had to slightly crane her neck to look at him. Pressing her lips against each other, she spoke in a whisper, thank you for the chain. You're welcome, he then yawned, bringing up his hand to his mouth before returning it back to his side. He then said, come, we have somewhere to go. Hearing this, Penny wondered where he was planning to go. The adventures of Damien Quinn never ended, at least that is what she thought to herself. What about the guests? She questioned, following him out of the attic. Damien closed the door and started to walk down the stairs. My family is there to entertain them. I am not needed here and have better work than this. Oh yes, I do have to meet Alexander before we leave. She followed Damien down the stairs, walking through the corridors now to hear the sound of the crowd who had gathered in and around the mansion. Offering them smiles which he didn't mean and that dropped when he walked past them. Penny guessed that the Lord of Valeria whom Damien had introduced him to be his cousin, she guessed that their relationship was close as in these past few days, she had not seen him close to anyone. The maximum went up to his sister but that was a greet, kissing airily next to the cheek. A lot of people interacted with Damien and outwardly he appeared to be someone who was always at the center of attention. Seeing Lord Alexander standing speaking to a woman, his eyes snapped to meet Damien's eyes. Penny stood a few distances apart, giving them the space they needed to talk as the Lord of Valeria appeared to be someone who didn't like his conversations to be heard, at least that is what happened. She wondered what went in a pure-blooded vampire's head. Someone who looked as if he was always scheming and was up to no good. No, he didn't say anything in regards to it. She overheard Alexander speak to Damien, you might need to send the samples by tomorrow morning at least. They need to test and make sure if that is what they think it is. Damien didn't react for 2 seconds until he said, I will get them delivered by the time of night. How long are you here? In Bone Lake. Maybe 2 days, Damien shook his head. In this beautiful mansion, he grinned for Lord Alexander to give a very faint smile which could hardly be distinguished to be called a smile. I will pass. I cannot afford Sister Grace knocking on my room for no reason which might make me want to throw her to the sea. You can always throw her in there. A good dip in the sea might clean that brain if hers. Florence was asking me to talk to you something. Though we never got to speak what it was about, said Alexander to ask his cousin, any clue on what it is? Chapter 93. Awareness. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Lord Alexander glanced at Penny and then at the new chain that she wore around her neck. He said something softly which made it difficult for her to hear anything. It wasn't that she wanted to hear what they were speaking, but with the Lord who looked at her to only down his volume, she couldn't help but want to feed her curiosity knowing what they were speaking about her. You gave her the family heirloom. Already making your moves. Damien smiled at Alexander's words. I have for a very long time, answered Damien, a crooked smile forming on his lips when Alexander raised his eyebrows. I thought for sure you would be collaring her. Especially with the way you dragged her out of the room. You noticed. Damien tilted his head. I am sure a whole lot of people noticed it. Along with you calling her beautiful and the other slaves to be ugly, said Alexander sipping the wine from his wine which led to the smile on Damien's lips to only widen. I have a cottage rented not too far from the next town. Have an errand to run too. Will you be getting her tested there? Damien thought about it. No, Alexander looked down at his glass, the liquid which was a color FO rich red, why not? What will you do if she turns out to someone or something that doesn't follow the normal standards of society? When was the last time any of us tried to follow the rules and moral codes that have been set up to be followed? We all bend and break them. Once they were done talking, Damien got the carriage ready by Falcon while getting the bottles of the potions that he had placed in his room. The same box from which Penny had taken out the tube for it to only break and fall on the ground. Penny stood outside the carriage, where Falcon helped in placing the box in. With the rain still pouring down, and if it weren't for the outstretched roof from the mansion, they would have got drenched too who had no protection from the rain. The coachman held the door for his master, but when it came to Penny, the man had let go of the door, leaving it to Penny on how she got inside the carriage. She was, after all, a slave, a human who was lower than the coachman himself. There was no need for her to be given any special treatment. When Penny went to push the door, her hand didn't reach it as Damien placed his hand on the door, preventing it from closing itself. Getting inside, she sat in the carriage. Feeling the awkwardness starting to lurk and creep in the space they sat in. For her master to hold the door for her, she wondered if the clouds were going to rain frogs. But the words in her mind was only trying to suffice the thought that had surfaced in her mind. She was curious about a lot of things, one of the things on what Lord Alexander had spoken while looking at her. But instead of asking that, she asked him, "Are we going to the council?" Last time when he found her with the bottle broken, he had told her about this box being a possession of the council which was going to be sent to the laboratory to test, which was located in the council. Good to see that you listen to my words carefully, unlike some really dumb creatures of yours and my own who conveniently ignore the important details. Though it doesn't happen often, I do not appreciate it when a person is not listening with full attention. "Apart from your freedom, what else do you want?" asked Damien, somewhere Penny questioned if he was purposefully switching the topic from one to another. But now that he had asked her so openly, Penny wondered what to ask. After a good amount of thinking, she asked, "Can I have my own room? I wouldn't mind one in the servants' quarters." "Okay, maybe I will gift you something myself," he smiled, ignoring her request right on her face, which had her eyes narrowing down at him. Damien had his hand placed at the edge which had a platform built next to the window. His chin resting on the edge of his palm. "Why do you want to change rooms?" His eyes observed the way her eyes darted at the empty seat next to him. It was possible that as he guessed she had a faint idea on the question that she had asked in the attic. She was feeling aware of his presence, which only made him look that scarier as he smiled further. Penny had no issues until now of sharing the room with him. Even if she did, she hadn't voiced out her opinions on it, but with the current change in their dynamics, she found it rather odd to share a room with Damien. All this time they had shared the status of master and a slave who was bought from the black market. A person who was opposite to the status of a pure-blooded vampire. Like Damien Quinn. For someone like him to give an heirloom, especially not any heirloom but something that belonged to his deceased mother. Penny wasn't slow by nature, and if she was right now, it was because of the person sitting in front of her who was behaving oddly with her. He was an odd one, to begin with, but right now their whole situation seemed different from what it was. Why did she want to get another room? What reason was she going to come up with? Asked Penny to herself. With the smile that had come down, Damien asked, "Is the bed uncomfortable?" "It is comfortable." "Is it the room that it is too cold?" "It is warm enough." Penny gulped at his questions. How was she supposed to say it was him? He had only once held her in his sleep early that morning, after which she had been alert and carefully. "Then what is the problem, little mouse?" "Too spacious for a little mouse like yourself." Chapter 94. Awareness. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Aren't all servants and maids assigned to a room in the servants' quarters? Won't it be fitting that I have a room there? It won't be right for your image if... Ho ho, Damien sarcastically laughed. "What image do you think I have in the society?" Penny wasn't sure if she were to view and let him know through her eyes or the others whom she had seen back in the mansion. "Must be good," she trailed with an awkward tone where her voice fizzled out in the end before her sentence could even start. Damien's smile disappeared slowly like a wax melting, his eyes looking at her with a scrutinizing gaze. "What do you mean must?" "I have an outstanding reputation with the people of the village, towns and the people in the high society. Of course, it's a completely different story when it comes to disgusting peasants who are brainless even when they belong to the literal class, especially." With the way his sentence was going, Penny was going to frown at his words until she heard the last half of what he had to say. "Do you doubt it?" he asked, and Penny could feel her back turning hot. "Yes, you must be a marvelous man," Penny agreed by making use of another word to see him not so happy. Did she say something wrong? Marvelous. Who told I was marvelous? I have an outstanding reputation when it comes to breaking people's limbs and snapping their heads. Torturing them for information until I am satisfied that that is all they have to offer. Penny had no words but to stare at him. One would have thought that when a person was praised they would let it go, but this man here was owning up to his actions, was also happy that he did it whilst enjoying it. Was she supposed to smile and nod her head to agree it was as fun as her master was saying when it came to breaking the hands and legs of a person? Or was she supposed to continue to sit quietly the way she was, as if she was pretty much part of the carriage, like the seat or the window, whose opinion didn't matter? Women who have come across me and have tasted these lips don't let go that easily. They crave it enough that even if I insult them they come back. Must be a group of masochists, don't you think so? How would she know his rendezvous with other women? She could see why the females of both humans and vampires were attracted to him. It wasn't just his looks, but the arrogance that he wore shamelessly with his unfiltered words had a charm of its own. Tell me, Penny. What do you think people think about me? Tell me through your eyes. Damien looked at her intrigued. Leaning his back against the seat where he crossed his legs. I don't think it matters what I see, what others see, Penny replied back as if wanting to swim far away from this question which had the possibility to be tricky. Trust me, it does. Pressed Damien for an answer. It is important to hear from you. His words carried itself in the wind which Penny took in as the air to breath. Damien could see that it was hard for her to start, having trouble with what to say. He wanted to see how smart this mouse was. Where they were going, he didn't need to run the tests to know who she was. Damien had met people of every kind. Having close contact with every creature anyone would come across, he didn't need tests and could identify the familiar creatures. What Penny was had been identified by only him and his cousin Alexander, who shared the same keen eye, doubted the kind she belonged to but was yet to realize. Penny didn't know what it was about today, but it appeared like Master Quinn was opening up with all sorts of questions and his statements catching her off guard one after another. His words were sarcastically tearful towards her, but there was something she couldn't deduce from his tone. His eyes staring at her intently while she hoped she was one of the parts of the carriage so that she could turn non-existent. Clearing her throat, she said, Today in the mansion when the party was going on, there were women who wanted your attention but you brushed them away. Some of them were shocked, a few disappointed, but it didn't seem like it was anything new as they recovered quickly. Or they were only putting up a face. The men, they fear you. More than men. Why do you think they fear me? Asked Damien as if he wasn't expecting to hear it or as if he had no clue about it. They are scared. Penny wasn't sure about these questions. Was he trying to educate her? You have instilled some sort of fear in them, enough to have them look and approach you warily. She saw Damien nod his head before saying, Getting back to the bedroom, are you aware of how many slaves are kept in the house? Badly, Penny whispered, remembering the lashes the slaves had received along with the humiliation in the public. I heard about cages, the whip, and torture, she stated softly from what she had heard by the woman named Caitlin who had been her cellmate for the short period of time in the slave establishment. What you hear is different from what actually goes on, mostly behind the closed doors and a few out in public where your very soul gets tarnished. It might be one of the reasons which cause the very hate that stems out to bloom with poison until the master or mistress is left dead, said Damien, looking outside the window where the rain had finally decided to slow down. Do you support the system of the slave establishment? Penny asked him, holding her breath as she waited for his answer. I don't. I actually have no interest in it whatsoever, deadpanned Damien like he hardly cared about it. Why did you buy me then? You can let me go, thought Penny to herself, which she didn't complete. I answered this. It is because it was you that I bought you from the market. If it was anyone else, I wouldn't have cared. To top it, who would pay 5,000? 3,000. Corrected Penny to see him smile. Yes, 3,000 gold coins for a mere slave is rather ridiculous, don't you think so? Why would I spend it for anyone? But he had for her, thought Penny to herself. I have enough maids and servants in the mansion. For some reason I feel we have gone through this question. Aren't you bored asking the same thing? Though I should appreciate your different approach. Good mouse, he praised her as if she really was a small animal with white ears and whiskers on her face. Chapter 95. Ride in the Carriage. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Music recommendation, Lucy Rose. Shiver, mushy, sure op, the journey was long, which Penny had forgotten to ask on how far away the council was. With no watch in her hand or pocket, she couldn't gauge the time. It wasn't that the time was passing slowly, with Damien as her fellow companion in the carriage. The time was never boring. "Are the outsiders allowed to visit, Master Damien?" she asked him, which also made her ask him, "What do you work as in the council?" "Me. I am an investigator, who pulls out information from various resources which is usually not seen or heard by the others. An intelligent team that is led by me and a boy named Cream, who is still learning. So it is just me and him. The council allows some guests inside the perimeter of the council. The laboratory isn't directly in the council building but has its own separate place, which should not be a problem. You are my pet girl, so it would mean you are my responsibility here." Seeing her nod, Damien looked out of the window, his eyes not looking for anything in particular, as he wondered if she would actually be able to step on the grounds of the council. It would be something to look forward to, thought Damien to himself. "Tell me something about your mother, Penny," he urged her, wanting to know about her from her very own lips than the little amount of information he had found before. Penny recollected the memory of her mother, her chest feeling warm even in this cold weather of the rain. She was a kind woman. Even with the villagers who often taunted her, she never retaliated back at them. Not a single word. When I was a child I wished she had answered them back, hoping they would stop, but as I grew up I realized maybe ignoring it was for the best." "Why would you say that?" he questioned her. "Sometimes it's better to fade away than be prominent in the village to only hear things you don't want to. People can be very vile, Master Damien," came out her whispered words. Penny adjusted her dress while sitting back against the seat, as she had come a little forward due to a bump on their path which one of the carriages will hit. She realized how opposite she was in comparison to Damien. At the same time, he spoke, "People will speak no matter. Even you do disappear to nothingness, people will continue to make rumored stories about you. That is how life is. Those are one of the disgusting creatures who have nothing else to do but make and throw garbage." As easy it was to be told, it was hard, thought Penny to herself. With her father gone, leaving only her mother and her, people never were kind. They had turned out to be the pair where the villagers liked gossiping about. Many times the market often refused to give them the minimal provision that was needed for their house to be run. Like food to eat and oil to burn through the lanterns to avoid bringing further darkness in their lives. "Have you ever had to experience something like that?" asked Penny to Damien, who hummed in response before saying, "Everyone goes through something similar." "You look at me in surprise," chuckled Damien. "No matter how much money one has, people will always have something to talk about. Be it the poor or rich. It doesn't matter to a lot in the crowd. Therefore I make sure they hear things first from my mouth, such that it has turned in a way where I don't get good feedback over some things, which is unfortunate on rare occasions, but who needs the silly donkey's opinion?" "A person who is rich has courage," Penny said, which was a well-known fact. When it came to the poor and rich, a rich man had the courage to speak, unlike the poor who had no resources. "I would agree with that. Money is one form of power that can be swung around, but that doesn't change the fact that you try to fade away in the background. Many times in life, you will find a lot of people who hate and despise you. For example, this little mouse. The reason might be as simple as this, where they heard something that was passed on to them. The people don't know you, have never conversed with you, but will still hate you because of the source. They fail to take the opportunity of knowing the person and fall flat in the line of brainless and morons whom you shouldn't concern yourself with. But if their words bother you, don't hold back in replying back on what you have to say." "I didn't say it bothered me." Penny replied to him defensively for him to give her a nod as if he believed. "Sure. I was only imparting some life thoughts. People who don't know you don't count to what you are. It is the people who know you by close distance. Measure from what they see you as, because strangers should be the least of your concern." Damien didn't know the details, but it wasn't hard for him to wonder about what the girl must have gone through. There are other things which are of grave importance in life. Villagers were often idiots making up things on a whim. They were the kind who jumped when someone pointed at a place, not even realizing there was no water in there. "Thank you," he heard her say, looking at him, a small smile which she had managed for him to smile quirkily. So was your mother beautiful too? Asked Damien, turning the conversation back from where it started. Penny felt her cheeks suddenly turn warm. 2. She had ignored at the mansion, but this was the second him calling her beautiful, or was she reading too much into his words? Chapter 96. The Council. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When they finally reached the council, Penny caught sight of the tall and wide building which looked white enough even in the dark. There was something about this place that made it appear daunting in her eyes. Once the carriage did stop, the coachman stepped down, opening the door of the carriage where Damien was the first one to step out. Not believing the coachman to handle the box, he pulled the box which slid on the flooring of the carriage before he picked it up in his arms. When Penny placed her feet on the ground, she felt a force as if it was trying to repulse her very leg when she stepped on the ground. At first glance, the council grounds looked serene and quiet. She could see some of the men walking by, in and out as if they had no time to rest with the work they were given. Walking behind Damien, who took to his right where another building stood which wasn't as magnificent as the one in the left, which appeared to be busy. Stepping inside the building, she was welcomed with a pungent smell of iron. Lanterns were placed hanging on the walls to light up the place, but it wasn't enough to brighten. Enough to walk without stumbling through the passage. The smell that wafted across her nose had first made her think that it was the rods of iron bars that looked evidently rusted. That wasn't what the iron-like smell came from, but the bodies that hid in the dark which were beaten up to unconsciousness. The people who broke rules and the law which was set by the council. People who didn't adhere to what was to be followed, to the moral laws. Unaware of the crimes as well as the people who were held in the cell, she continued to walk right behind Damien. Reaching the door, he knocked on it before stepping inside ere a lean man stood in front of something. Due to the overwhelming smell of the iron bars which were terribly rusted, one couldn't have realized the smell that came from the other side of the room until they had stepped inside. Penny caught sight of the person who laid on the table, but it wasn't any living person who laid there sleeping, but a dead body that was charred. The smell that came from the decomposing body was hard to ignore, and she had to raise her hand to cover her nose with it from inhaling it too much. With the clothes not being worn, she noticed it was a man who had been charred. Councilman Damien, the man in the white coat, greeted Damien, his eyes merely taking the sight of the girl before his bright red eyes went back to Damien. Good evening, Murch. Who is this? Damien tipped his head towards the dead body. Going to one side of the walls where the equipment and instruments were placed, he picked up the white gloves. Looks like a vampire. He wore the gloves one by one. He indeed is a vampire. His fangs were pulled out of his mouth, answered the scrawny-looking man. Penny, meet Murch. He is the man who looks after the bodies that come down here which needs further examination, said Damien, turning to look at Penny over his shoulder. I heard you bought a new slave. Is she the one? Asked Murch with a lack of curiosity, as he seemed more interested in the body of the dead than the living. Looks like the news spreads faster here in the council than outside. Where did you hear it from? Asked Damien. Bending down, he took hold of the body on the table, opening the mouth and looking at the dead person's cavity. It was Councilman Lancelot and Councilman Creed, answered Murch before walking forward to see what Damien was doing with the body. Usually, Murch didn't allow anyone to touch the bodies which were given to him, as it was his responsibility. The last thing he would want is for someone to contaminate the body and tarnish the evidence. He let a few of them inside while most of them stayed out unless it was a pressing matter that needed assistance with. But with Damien Quinn, it was a different case. In the past, there had been times where the pure-blooded vampire had helped him solve the mysteries of the body faster than him, which saved a good amount of time. Also, another reason being Damien barged right into the room, looking through the things as if he were inspecting it before leaving the building. It appears that Councilman Creed has been quite free with his hands and mind. Maybe it is time to put in a word with the head council about it than go gossiping like women. No offense, Penny, he said, looking to his side but not meeting Penny's eyes. What does the case state? What is the offense? Did you check with the fluid test? Run me a background, Penny heard Damien say to the doctor, who nodded his head. Rubbing his hands together, the vampire doctor named Murch went to tell, the case is being handled by Rigowan. The council had one trial until now. Fresh case, chipped Damien. Very new. The body came in here yesterday. Damien took another step forward, bending more before he took one of the small quill-sized instruments to probe into the dead man's mouth. It seems they found the body, which was buried behind a wall that had been placed in the house. Behind a wall. Who committed the crime? It is a family of vampires. Currently, they are still trying to find out, as I heard that the murder looked nothing less to a cold one. But speculations from the court tells that it was his brother who killed and placed him like this. Logan Wills is the brother's name. And this is Lucas Wills. Is he the younger brother? Chapter 97. The Council. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. No, he's the older one, answered Murch, his eyes taking in what Damien was doing. A family of vampires, you say, hummed Damien before standing up straight. You have the filed report which was submitted to the council room. It should be somewhere here. Ah, here it is. The lean doctor walked to the desk, his frame making Penny remind her of the time when she used to let a cloth dry as the wind blew at it. Handing over the parchment, which was bound with a flap around it, Damien twisted it out to open the parchment and read what was written in it. Penny in the meantime looked around the room, which wasn't too big but enough to have two more bodies in here. It made her wonder what happened to other bodies if the count increased in a day. Surely, there was a place to accommodate other bodies here or somewhere that wasn't too far from the council building. Little bottles were placed on the shelf, something that's similar to the ones that they had brought in here right now, but these were of different colors that held no label on it. Taking a step closer to Damien, she looked down at the body, this time much more clearly. The sight was ghastly, which looked nothing less to a horror she would have imagined how a ghost would look like. The person had eyes that were black in color. No hair on the body as if had been burnt only halfway through while leaving the person to suffer. It was a disturbing view which Penny couldn't stop herself from frowning. The hands were left crooked, the skin that had half melted making it look odd. The report here says that he's a vampire, but I doubt he is, said Damien to receive a frown from the doctor. But he had fangs, said the doctor, for Damien to start pulling the gloves that he wore, throwing it into the sink. Murch bent down, taking another look at the dead man's cavity. He positively has fangs. Where is it written that a person needs to have fangs to be identified as a vampire from the very birth? Damien asked as he picked up a bottle and squeezed the gel-like liquid on his hand. As he rubbed both his hands, he said, the report says he was from a family of low vampires, but it doesn't appear that he is a vampire. Maybe a turned one, not a recent one though, as it's been dated since child, which might be a wrong entry. Penny, who stood not too far from the body, looked at the dead person's face. The spots at the ends of his eyes is one of the very evidence which comes under the transformation of a human turning to a vampire. He is not a vampire, murmured the vampire doctor. Penny looked at the body and then at Damien, who was eyeing the bottles that were set on the table. They fell out of his mouth. The council in the court wrote down that it was pulled out forcibly for the shame that was caused, said Murch, standing away from the body. Rubbish. The council doesn't check enough. There are only some who do a decent job while the rest only slack. It makes me wonder how they even passed the council exam in the first place. This man, he must have been a human, a man who was either adopted or the entire family who were turned one after another. It can be either of them. Sometimes fangs fall off right after the transformation, which is one of the many symptoms that the transition didn't go well. Thank you, Councilman Damien. I will be sure to let the case handlers know what it is so that they can look into the case further. Why don't you join the council of groups? With your intellect you would be able to find and solve the unsolved cases quickly. Damien didn't bother to respond and instead opened the box which he had bought from his mansion that had to be delivered. It needs a lot of work. I prefer to have my hands empty than keep them full, but lately, they have turned full thanks to the black witches who never rest. The vampire doctor came around to notice a slot empty while the others had little tubes in them. Did it come like this? It did, asked Damien for Murch to look at him confused. One of the tubes is missing. Murch continued to look at the box to hear a hum from the councilman. So I see. This is the box for the potions that have been created by black witches. They need to be tested to check on what they are made of. Is this what I think it is? Corruption. Penny heard the vampire's words trail in question. It looked like most of the questions that were asked to Damien, the pure-blooded vampire conveniently ignored the questions as if it were asked to him. Get it tested quickly by tomorrow morning. I will be back here. Wait, the tube here is green. Is it another potion which is special? There was excitement in Murch's voice as he said it. Ah no, the light in the vampire's eyes dimmed down. It is green for another reason. What reason is it? Asked Damien, interested in knowing what just happened. Give me a moment, said the scrawny doctor, to take the tube to place it on an instrument and look at the tube through a hole that Penny didn't know what it was. It's not what I thought, but they appear to have different properties, something similar and distinctive to water. The water holds no impurities, stated Damien, where his eyes trailed from the doctor to Penny. The doctor to nod his head after he pulled away from his instrument to only get back to continue to observe it. Councilman Damien, is this tube being mixed up with the rest? Came Murch's voice, his hand turning a knob on the instrument as he continued to stare in it. There are elements of the witchery which a white witch uses. Penny had been standing quietly when she felt Damien's gaze on her to say, White witch you say? Why was he staring at her as if to imply she was a witch? Chapter 98. Dead Men. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Penelope stared back at Damien, who was looking at her casually, but his casual gaze wasn't exactly casual. What else do you see in the potion in there? Asked Damien, slowly shifting his gaze back on the doctor, picking up another solution from the box which was transparent in color. The others hold the property of spit grass. It is the very element that is responsible for the trigger that takes place in all the vampires, affecting mostly the pure-blooded vampires due to the core that sits at the core of the heart, said Murch, who moved back from the instrument where he had been observing the liquid that he had poured to look under the magnifying glass. But this here is nothing less to a white witch's blood. I am curious how this bottle came to your hand. Damien didn't respond to it, his eyes intently looking at the dead body that laid on the table motionless. The vampire doctor continued to say, the council found an interesting piece just this evening. Would you like to take a look? Asked the vampire, who held eagerness in his eyes. Damien raised his hand indicating the vampire to lead him, but Murch didn't start to walk. Seeing the girl who was in the room here with them, the man found her to be nothing less than an intrusive creature which he wasn't happy about. Seeing Murch's gaze, Damien said, she's with me. The doctor. Vampire led them out of the room. Locking the room first as he carried a lantern in his hand, he started to lead the way where Damien followed behind Murch and Penny followed Damien. When the light started to enter the cell rooms which had previously been dark, Penny finally saw the people who were in there, her eyes unable to move from them. Each cell had one person, the atmosphere feeling nothing less to the slave establishment but the condition they were in. Penny continued to follow to see people in there who were shackled and bound in chains, but that wasn't the highlight. It was the bruises and the dried blood which had been overpowering before and now. Not the rusted iron bars, but it had been the smell of the blood. Murch took them to the underground, which was another passage. Reaching to greet a brown door made of metal, the vampire doctor fished his hand in his coat. Pulling out a bunch of keys, he fumbled around before opening the lock of the door. The building here was much quieter with no visitors, as it was the time of night now. The people in the cell were too tired to speak and cause a riot with the number of beatings they had taken along with the torture the councilman presented the lawbreakers. The most one could hear was the murmur and groan which reached Penny's ears, but for some odd reason, it was still quiet. When Penny began to wonder as to what the room held for a door like this had to be built, the answers to her questions were answered after entering the room. She had to hold back her breath, looking at the large cylindrical glasses that were filled with glasses, but each transparent glass-like cylinder held bodies that floated in the water. Except for 2 cylinders, the rest of them were occupied. It was obvious that the people inside there were all dead. Every one of them. Damien strolled through the cylinders, walking past them unaffected as he had been down here several times. Penny, on the other hand, walking to only stop and look up at the man who was inside one of the many cylinders. The eyes of the man were not closed but were instead open as if he was experiencing some kind of shock even after death. He was lean in nature, his body almost reduced to bones where his skin stuck to the only possible solid thing in his body. Penny wasn't sure why, but there was something about this man that lured her to him. Was it his haunting eyes that was wide? Or was it the body that looked crumpled? She couldn't decide which one was it, but there was definitely something about this man. Murch and Damien went to look at something the vampire doctor wanted to show while Penny stayed behind. Continuing to look at the man who looked like he was looking at something ahead of him. She turned to see what it was out of curiosity, but there was nothing but a wall in there. Why were the bodies placed in here like this? Thought Penny to herself. This place was nothing less to a graveyard. The only difference being, a graveyard was a place where the dead were buried underground, and here it was that the bodies floated in the water. She doubted it was water, as Penny had the basic understanding that water could not preserve dead bodies without decaying. If one had to, they would use salt, but salt would only shrivel the skin, and right now the skin didn't seem to look damaged. Taking a step closer, she placed her hand on the cylindrical glass, observing the person, when she suddenly felt the man's eyes who had been looking forward to looking at her. Penny staggered back, withdrawing her hand quickly and away from the glass. Her breath hitching out of shock for Damien to notice, who had tuned his ears around his surroundings. Penny looked again at the man, but it seemed like he hadn't moved his eyes to look at her at all. Worried, she wondered if she had imagined it, but she felt it had happened, which made her only that much wary of her surroundings right now. Her eyes taking note of all the bodies that were here, floating in the liquid inside the cylinder. When Damien came walking to where she stood, with the vampire doctor tailing behind closely, she asked, "Who is he, Eddie E.T.?" Chapter 99. Dead Men. Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. He's a deranged vampire. Murch was the one to answer, who stood behind Damien, Damien's height overpowering the little vampire's stature. Deranged vampire. It's a human or a vampire who has his body corrupted. Damien stared at the man in the cylinder with a bored expression, as he had been seeing for many years now, to not be bothered about his appearance. Unlike the pure-blooded vampire who is affected by the corruption of the heart where the core lies. If a human's transition from the current state who is undergoing to turn to a vampire doesn't do well, chances are they get corrupted similar to the pure-blooded vampires. He turned away to look at her, his eyes subtly checking her eyes if they were dilated. His eyes roamed around, taking in the vast room which held several bodies in an enclosed glass. I thought it affected only the vampires. It does, confirmed Damien to say. The problem arises only if a human decides or is forced to transform into the low-level bred vampire. A vampire's bite can be helpful or repulsive ere the body starts to make or break. To add to this, Damien said, this man was one of the few test subjects found in the land of Bone Lake. His features are unique enough that Murch decided to add him up to his collection. Murch laughed nervously. Councilman Damien, this isn't a collection but subjects that have unique conditions. They are some of the value, you could say, said the doctor, wringing his hands together. The council laboratory was built and assigned in a way where Murch was the one who had been handling the work for years. Enough that 3 head councils had been replaced since his assignment to the job. The interest he held in his word and the secrecy that was to be maintained here in isolation had turned the vampire less normal compared to the others. Every person in the cylinder in here was a type of species who was rare, but that wasn't all to it. They were the cases that were bizarre and couldn't be solved by the councilman. Most of the cases were always solved which didn't need to vacancy down in this room, but once in every 1 or 2 years, cases reached the council that couldn't be explained. Bodies like those were placed in here, having a special spot where the soul didn't rest. Noticing Penny's eager-looking eyes that were seeking answers, the doctor puffed his chest, letting his tongue loose to something he was not supposed to go saying out and loud. The case was closed by one of the elder head counsel a few years ago. Year 1854, Murch glanced at the number plate that was plastered down on the metal before the glass encasing began. He was an early corrupted human who was acquired buried deep down in the water with a stone that was tied around his leg. A mark that once had been red around the man's ankle now had turned dark and brown in time. You see, some things can be explained while some cannot be. Did that mean this one wasn't solved? Not questioning anything. As if shifting topic, the vampire doctor said, "What do you think of the witch? She's half witch and half human." "Burn her," was Damien's response to it. Damien walked towards a body that Murch had only placed on the table, who was deciding if he had to add the woman to his room collection or throw her away. Leaving the dead man in the glass, Penny walked behind Damien where she caught sight of another being. The face that had turned dark where the skin had turned to look scaly. A black witch, Penny registered it in her mind. "I found this one near the Lake of Bones. She was climbing the tree and the blood was oozing out from her fingers. I thought they were only rumors until I saw this," said Murch, tipping his head towards the witch who laid flat on her back. "Rumors are stemmed through something. Haven't you heard there's no smoke without a fire? I guess this is one work that I would love to look into." Damien smiled, tilting his head to look at the witch's face. "Some of the witches have been trying to bring the humans to their side. Turning the humans to one of them seems to be one of the moves, but like everything else, a human body cannot bear things. It is made of limitations. Write down the report on it." "I will take it in the morning," said Damien before taking his leave from the room where Penny followed him back. When they reached back the carriage, Damien said to the coachman, "Fetch water for the horses. We will be leaving after that." The coachman bowed his head, turning his back to walk towards the shed which was made to place some of the horses which the councilman used. Once he was away, Damien said to her, "Get inside the carriage." "Go on," he said, the look on his face which was serious, no mischief in his eyes which turned her worried. Had she done something she was not supposed to do? "I am not a white witch," blurted Penny in her haste as she inched closer to the carriage door. "Are you 100% sure?" At his question, she gulped. She knew how much witches were hated everywhere. It didn't matter if the person was a white witch or a black witch. The bottom of the surface was that witches were all bad and were meant to die. "Get inside. We don't have much time." Pursing her lips, she got inside the carriage and soon Damien followed her. When she took a seat, he pulled the door of the carriage close while also pulling out the little curtains of the window to a close. Penny wondered what was going on in his mind. Master Damien. Without another word, Damien took hold of her hand which was on her lap and bit into her hand. Chapter 100. What You Want. Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Penelope flinched at the sudden pain of the fangs piercing through her skin where a mouth latched on as if a piece of bread had been hanging in the air. The bite wasn't a long one but a short quick one where Damien let go of her hand after she had overcome the initial shock. She took her hand, holding it close to her chest but taking a look at the same time to see the 2 holes which Damien had made. "Why did you do that?" she asked him wide-eyed, her face holding the expression of shock. Was he so hungry that he had decided to have her as the spare blood body, or should she say emergency food? "Your blood tastes sweet. Give it back, let me have another bite," said Damien raising his hand towards her, but Penny scooted away to go the other corner of the carriage. Not that it would make much difference as it was a small space where she had no place to run except for the window which couldn't fit her. Having never been bitten before in her life except, she looked at him with a skeptical look. Staring at each other. Damien's pink tongue peeked out of his lips, wiping the blood off his lips to catch his Adam's apple bob up and down. After a few seconds, Penny asked, "You aren't hungry, are you?" "What makes you think I am not?" When Penny didn't answer and only continued to stare at him, "How rude of you to refuse your master a meal when he is hungry." Should I perhaps punish you here? She saw him shift from his seat closer to her, and this time she gulped softly. Was he really going to drink her blood? She remembered the time when he had taken blood from Lady Yvain's neck until the lady had passed out. Seeing the fear start to swirl in her green eyes, a smile cracked on Damien's lips as he spoke, "Give me your hand. Be a good mouse, sweetheart." Hearing the sweet words from him only made her that much wary about him. "I won't bite this time." The smile simmered down, making her wonder why he was asking for her hand if it weren't for him biting her. He hummed as if he were waiting, and reluctantly, Penny gave her hand to him. Placing it on his while he grasped it firmly to bring it back close to his face, which alarmed, her heart beating loudly as she readied herself for the pain. This master of hers had only given his word of not biting her, and it was not even a minute that he was ready to open as she saw him part his lips. "You told you wouldn't bite," came out the whispered, rushed words from her mouth. Her eyes looked at him, moving softly as it jumped to look from one eye of his to another. Her own lips parted as she tried to breathe in. Damien, who had leaned forward towards her hand, pulled his head back. "Penelope, you have only seen the worst things of the slave establishment. Of slaves going through torture, pain, death, some losing their mind before they are handed to their master and mistresses. Most of them take the by slaves for their own amuse.em.e.nt. Do you know why I bought you? You always ask me why I bought you. Let's see if you can answer it today," he said, making her frown. How would she know why he had bought her? When her heart hitched at him leaning back to her hand which he still held in his, he said, "I said I wouldn't bite you," and with that, Damien licked the wound he had caused without single remorse of him touching a person lower than him right now intimately. Penny had stopped breathing. Her eyes wider than before, goosebumps starting to form all over her skin. Damien gave a few more licks, closing the wound every time his coarse tongue came in contact with her hand. The entire scene in front of her was erotic. With his hair that he had previously ruffled, it came to brush her hand like a feather. Damien looked nothing less to a cat, a black one maybe because of his pitch-black hair, with his eyes closed until they opened to look right at her. When he finally raised his head back, the grip on her hand loosening for her to slip out but for him to catch hold of her index finger, always in such hurry to run away. "I did not run away," came out Penny's response, her heart thundering in her heart, and she was hardly bothered with it as her master Damien had licked her hand. Which man did that? She fretted internally. Damien leaned back, his eyes on her which were filled with amuse.em.e.nt. "Are you saying the thought of you trying to run away tonight never crossed your mind?" Unfortunately for Penny, though, even though she tried not to bring any emotions out, her heart betrayed her. To run when there is a room full of vampires who might want to hunt you, you should know better, Penny, that did cross her mind. She was aware that running at this time of the night though looked feasible, at the same time she would invite the same amount of risk, though a lot of abuse slaves, some of them want to build a good relationship of the master and slave. It is a matter of the slave putting their whole life to dedicate their life, while the master will provide the roof that the slave craves. But it is more than that. It is a matter of trust which not many can build and maintain. It doesn't change the dynamics that much, Master Damien. A slave will still be treated beneath everyone else, and you never know when their life will be taken. That is where you are wrong. Penelope, my cousin, and I often play chess as a leisure game. If there was one thing I have learned in there, the mere soldier who is brave enough to sacrifice can play until the end to be whatever he wants in the end.